It's This Week in Creationism, episode number 49. I'm your host, Joel Duff. We take a look here at the headlines in creationism from the past week. I want to talk a little bit about the Is Genesis History sequel, right? The film from 2017 that has spawned a whole bunch, I guess you could say, an apologetics ministry. And what's going on with this sequel that keeps getting delayed? Let's talk about those delays and what might be in that film coming up and how it kind of fits into the whole young earth creationist scene right now, where there's a lot of back and forth between different organizations and individuals and organizations. How is that affecting this particular film? We've got to talk about Answers in Genesis continued series warning other young earth creationists about young earth evolutionists within their midst. But this time, we're more going to focus on the young earth evolutionist response, all right? They haven't simply sat back and taken this attack upon them, but they are responding to the various claims of Answers in Genesis. So I want to look at a couple of those different responses here. And also, we need to go to ICR, see what's happening on their website. Well, they're talking about hexagons being a product of design, and also about their cave fish research. So let's take a brief look at those two things. So we've got all that coming up. So what's going on with Is Genesis History? This is the front page for the Is Genesis History website. And you can see here that they have a number of different resources. They've got a shop where you can purchase the documentary, the namesake for Is Genesis History. But they have, since 2017, let me show you this information. So here's a little info about the original video, or the original movie documentary that was released to theaters it was a Fathom event. And you can see there it raised grossed $2.7 million. That might not sound like a whole lot, but this was actually a pretty big deal. I think it was over 2 nights. Originally, it was going to be 1 day only, right, showings, and then they had to expand it out to, I believe, another night after that. The theater I went and saw it in was nearly packed, and so this was a very successful event, right? It's a limited release through Fathom events. But nonetheless, really brought them to the forefront of young earth creationism at the time. And I've explained on my blog and elsewhere that I thought this was a very important event because it drew in individuals from a number of different creation science organizations and a whole bunch of, we'll call them fringe young earth creationists, or creationists around the edges of the major apologetics ministry. So, for example, faculty members at Christian colleges and other independent creationists. Right, kind of brought them all together, presented this question: Is Genesis history? And then presented what to this particular producer, Thomas Purifoy Jr. He sort of scripted this thing to be a big, broad overlook at, like, here's what creation scientists do. Here's the types of things they're studying. And so it was a little bit of astronomy, a little bit of geology, a little bit of biology, and a little bit of the biblical theological question there. Asking the question, is Genesis history? And of course, their answer was, is Genesis history? Well, of course, it's history, and it's a specific history. It's a specific history of a young earth. And what's the evidence to support that young earth? All right, so here's the film. Eventually, this website and all these other resources are going to build out of that film. And in a way, I've described Is Genesis history as sort of another organization, although it's not specifically an apologetics ministry. It's very much focused on, like, the research side of things. It's kind of like old school creation science, like trying to support the biblical view, but really focusing on sort of the scientific aspects in many ways. Well, for a number of years now, they've been promoting the idea that there is a second film, right? There's going to be a second release, and it's going to be Is Genesis History, Mountains After the Flood. And way back when I began this series, This Week in Creationism, it was in the very early episodes, I talked about how there's a new, Is Genesis History coming out, and I speculated about what might possibly be in that particular film. Well, that was a year and a half ago, and they were still, they were at that time saying it was coming out soon, right? Whatever soon meant, 2022 possibly. Well, it's March 2023, it's still not there. And a few months ago, actually probably about 6 months ago now, they began this crowdfunding campaign. They said, well, the principal viewing, the principal photography is all done, right? The video has been taken, but we need to do the post-processing, add the music, cuts, and all that type of stuff, and maybe some dialogue on top. And all of that, we really need to have a little extra money to finish this off. So they had this crowdfunding campaign. As you can see here, as of yesterday, they've actually raised $290,000 out of their $275,000 goal to finish the film. And at the time, they said that they would be released in late 2022 or early 2023. So they didn't make the 2022 deadline. Then they talked about, just a couple weeks ago, it said it was going to be released in March of 2023. And of course, it is March now. And I believe I even heard Marcus Ross mention that he thought it was going to be released in March of 2023 too, just in a video not long ago that I'm going to mention in just a few minutes. But March is flying past, and now what we've just had the website updated again. And now it says, currently finishing the animations for the film. We're expected to be released in 2023. It's not clear to me whether released means released into theaters as a Fathom event. Is it going to be a big deal? It doesn't feel like it. This just feels like a straight-to-video type of thing, and they're just going to promote it on their site. But I might be wrong. I mean, I'm kind of hoping it's in the theater because I would plan to attend and kind of, write a review of it, and we would talk about it. All right, so what's going to be in this film? All right, they're going to follow Del Tackett, who's going to be the narrator. He's going to follow a team of scientists. This has all been filmed. We already know what the major story is, and that is it's going to be following the story of the Grand Canyon research of Dr. Snelling from Answers in Genesis. He's been looking at different folds in rocks deep in the geological column of the Grand Canyon, and he's actually published a couple articles on that in the past year in his own journal at Answers in Genesis. And so I suspect that that's going to be like the core of this film, is showing Snelling's research. But it's also going to include some research by John Whitmore, who's a faculty member at, I believe, Cedarville University here in Ohio. And you can see that, like, depending on what kind of donation you give, we've got you'll get a Nydia fish fossil if you donate $125 to the crowdfunding campaign. And that's going to come from his featured research. And I'm pretty sure, based on some of the articles they've published, that his research is also going to be highlighted in this article. Now, that brings me to the point where we can begin to discuss, what are some of the challenges for mountains after the flood? You see, what this film is supposed to be is, okay, so the flood happened. We've established the flood is a real thing, a global flood. But now the question is, what happened after the flood, and how do we get to the topology of the world we have today? In other words, there are mountains and valleys, and there are waterfalls, and right, there's all these different interesting geological features on the face of the earth. And although it's kind of easy, it's for young earth creationists, typically it's just been like the flood made those things. Young earth creationists today don't believe that, like, many of the surface features are the result of things that happened during the flood, but things that happened after the flood. And that brings up the big question that young earth creationists, one of the big questions that young earth creationists have no agreement upon, and that is, where do the flood rocks, right? What rocks were laid down during the flood itself? And then there was a point in time in which Noah and animals got off the ark, right? Departed the ark, and that would be the termination, really, of the flood. And then they started to spread across the world. And as they spread across the world, then any new sediments that were laid on top of that would be post-flood, right? So, and any erosion that happens after that would be post-flood erosion. Any mountains that are pushed up would be mountains that are created after the flood. Any volcanoes that occur after Noah stepped off the ark would be post-flood geological formations. So how much of the world we see today are post-flood geological formations and the result of geological events after the flood versus what's part of the flood itself? This has not been an easy question to answer for young earth creationists, but it's a very important question. Because if the animals are marching across the earth from the ark, and then they get preserved in sediments after the flood, then those are post-flood fossils. So if you look at a long sequence of rock and you ask the question, like, here's all these different fossils. Well, these were all laid down because they were part of the flood, right? They were killed by the flood. Where is the break point between this was not the flood and then these animals, these fossils are not part of the flood? Because there's no like really strict discontinuous moment in the fossil record, well, maybe other than the KPG boundary, right, where the Cretaceous Paleogene boundary where the asteroid struck the Earth, or at least although some young creationists don't believe an asteroid struck the Earth at that point. Nonetheless, there is something of a break point there in the fossil record, in that there's a large transition in the types of fossils that are found below that point and above it. And that's why many young Earth creationists place the post-flood boundary right about that point. They say like everything after that is post-flood events. And if you know anything about the geological column, you know that that includes an enormous amount of stuff, right? There's an enormous amount of rock in some places in the world that is after that KPG boundary. And that's an enormous number, hundreds of trillions of fossils that are in the fossil record that are post-flood. But here's the rub, all right? That's some young Earth creationists believe that's where the post-flood boundary is. Others believe it is far higher in the fossil record, and so therefore only a very small little bit of the very top layer surface of what we see today, and only a very small number of the fossils that are represented in those rocks are actually post-flood remnants. All right, post-flood remains. Those are very highly contrasting views within the young Earth creationist community about where the flood begins and ends. And so I've said since the very beginning that by taking on the challenge of talking about mountains after the flood and what happened after the flood, they're dipping their toes in. I'm not sure they're dipping their toes. I think they're going full in, or I thought they were, going full into this question of, like, how are we going to explain what happened after the flood? We're going to have to decide where the post-flood boundary is, because we can't talk about the way the world looks. I can't even talk about the types of organisms and different kinds of organisms, how they've diversified, until you've decided this question about where the post-flood boundary is. So I figured for this film, they're going to have to make a decision. And then depending on what they decide, that should determine really who's going to be invited to like be participants in the film, because it's going to be hard to have it's going to be hard to show a multitude of views. It was kind of easy in the first film to kind of like present a global look at young Earth creationism and big arguments for why the Earth is young and for Noah's flood. But now we're getting down into specifics, and when you get to specifics, that's when you start dividing people into different opinions about exactly how you explain the observed world around us. So I've thought from the very beginning, this script is going to be very difficult to write to make it really compelling. And although I don't know who is going to be in the film, and they've been very careful not to talk very much about the film itself, other than the part about Snelling and the Grand Canyon, I have this feeling now that it's all been pared down quite a bit. And now they're just going to focus on a few science stories, and they'll talk about they're just going to talk about this the Grand Canyon thing as just interesting creation research. And they're going to talk about deep folding as being part of the flood rocks, which really isn't a story about what happened after the flood. And maybe they're going to be able to talk about it in such a way they don't have to make that decision and talk about the post-flood boundary. However, the reason I've highlighted something on your screen here, received a fossil fish from the Green River Formation, a post-flood lake featured in Dr. Whitmer's research. Just including that word, a post-flood lake, is taking a position. All right, it's taking a position because the Green River Formation, which is out in Wyoming and northern Utah, the layers of rocks there are thought to be the result of some very large lakes that were present there that filled up with sediments. And now I just use the word lakes. Now, by using the word lakes, I'm suggesting they were post-flood lakes. There was large lakes after the flood, and that's what some young Earth creationists believe. Andrew Snelling believes they were post-flood lakes. Obviously, John Whitmore believes that there were large lakes that existed after the flood, and therefore all the fossils, like for example these fish lived after the flood. They lived in a lake, and that lake they then got preserved in that lake sometime after the flood, which means they're less than 4,350 years old. So if they've been preserved after the flood, but that's not what all young Earth creationists believe, right? ICR and some other young Earth creationists put the flood boundary much higher, and they say the entire Green River Formation was part of the flood itself. So if you're trying to explain what did the world look like and what did this post-flood world, how did it develop, and one person is explaining how there was these large floods and then there was volcanoes, and the volcanoes dropped ash into that water, which then killed some of the fish and that preserved some of them as a post-flood event. And then remember, there are also bats, and there are, in the Green River Formation, there are all kinds of plants in the Green River Formation, and there are a variety of other types of animals that have been preserved in the Green River Formation. So if it's post-flood, and there are various animals like bats there, those bats had to have been on the Ark. And then they had to get to that particular location in order to be preserved after the flood. But if you think that the whole lake system is not really a lake system, but it's just layers of sediment laid down by a global flood, the global lake, I guess you could say, then the fossils you are finding are not actually preserved from the flood. Are not being preserved after the flood. They're being preserved during the flood. Those are very different views, and very different views of what kind of organisms populated the world after the flood. Okay. We're going too far into the flood, post-flood thing. The point being is that the director and producer has a very large challenge in front of them in terms of being able to make a sort of universally loved young Earth creationist film. Because by taking positions on this, it's making it difficult for some organizations and some young Earth creationists to fully embrace this particular film. They feel like they're going to have to criticize it. Whereas the first one didn't really receive much criticism really within the young Earth creationist community. Now, the other thing that's going on here, and if you've listened to me at all, there's a bunch of stuff going on in young Earth creationism. And that is that ICR has kind of like, they've left the station and they are kind of like off on their own, Institute for Creation Research, and they are staking claims to a variety of different unique positions within young Earth creationism. One would be this very, very late flood boundary. And by unique, I don't mean it's like exclusive to them, but like they're committed to that. And there's a few other people that agree with them. The other thing they are into is continuous environmental tracking as a particular, as their explanation for the diversity of life. And that's very different than Answers in Genesis and Creation Ministries International, which is much more open to using words like natural selection, mutations, and so forth. There is that particular, I'm not going to call it a schism. I'll just say it is a division that is arising in the scientific explanations they have to accommodate for a young Earth. And then you have Answers in Genesis, which is out there complaining about how evolutionary ideas are seeping into young Earth creationism all over the place. But of course, we're going to see in just a few minutes that the young Earth evolutionists, which are just the folks that Answers in Genesis are calling young Earth evolutionists, are pushing back and saying, we're really no different than Answers in Genesis. I mean, if we're young Earth evolutionists, then you are too, which is just what I've been saying all along about the lack of distinction, really, when it comes right down to it, between what they perceive as young Earth evolutionists and Answers in Genesis. All right, so you have a situation in young Earth creationism where you have a number of different factions that aren't happy with others, and there's not a lot of unanimity about some really essential core ideas, core concepts that have to be agreed upon in order to sort of build a larger structure of young Earth creationism as an explanatory framework that they hope that someday will explain the age of the Earth and the diversity of organisms on Earth as a competing mechanism against, say, Darwinian evolution and conventional geology. So within that context, here comes Is Genesis History. And I'm going to remind you that Is Genesis History mostly included sort of outsiders in the young Earth creationist community. They had Andrew Snelling, yes. They had Rob Carter from Creation Ministries International. But ICR was pretty much on the outs. It wasn't really represented in the previous film. And then they had a bunch of people that were Kurt Wise and Steve Austin and a couple other professors at different Christian colleges. So people not employed in the large creation ministries were really the major focus. And if you go back and now, and as I've done, and look at who was involved in that film. Oh, Todd Wood, I have to point him out. Marcus Ross. And I start listing off those names. And then you look at who is Answers in Genesis calling out as being young Earth evolutionists, being under the influence of evolutionary biology and bringing evolutionary ideas into the, like the Trojan horse, into the young Earth creationist camp. Who are those individuals? A lot of them are ones that were part of the Is Genesis History original film. And then the Is Genesis History website, along with a blog that they run, which has a bunch of students that do writing, all of them, every one of them on that particular blog, you could label as being part of what Answers in Genesis are calling young Earth evolutionists. So now that makes it doubly difficult for Is Genesis History as they're trying to navigate these waters, right? They're trying to produce something that is independent, not part of the major organizations, and yet they're trying to pull experts from different areas. But those experts may not necessarily want to come together and be it may be hard for them to work together because of their differences or their organizational preferences. Like Answers, I'm sure Ken Ham and others have viewpoints about how much their employees should work with other employees at other institutions. So what I've thought is all along that it was going to be harder for them to pull together sort of a superstar set of scientists that they could follow, which is why I think it's really stripped down to, I'm not going to be surprised if it's basically a story about Andrew Snelling and then a couple other stories like Whitmore and then maybe a few other things and a few other people. But who shows up in the film is going to say a lot about Purifoy and what he thinks the direction of young Earth creationism is. I said way back when that Is Genesis History, let me go back up here. I said way back in 2017, I thought Is Genesis History is a breakshed moment, all right, in the history of young Earth creationism, because it was a collection of a bunch of different, fairly well-known names, but not ones that were all part of young Earth creationist ministries, which kind of like Ken Ham has become like the 10-ton gorilla, right, of young Earth creationism, where whatever he has said and done in his organization has promoted as like the position of young Earth creationism has kind of by default become the position of what the lay Christian believes young Earth creationism is. And Is Genesis History came along and said, we're not going to just be like, Answers in Genesis is going to tell us what to do, and all of their folk are going to be in our particular movie, and we're going to follow them around. No, we're actually going to like showcase a bunch of other people who haven't normally been showcased in the same way, haven't gotten as much attention, but are really like actually the thinkers of young Earth creationism. If there are people that actually sit around and think about this stuff and really intelligently look into these questions and are actually interested in doing some research, you don't really go to the major creationist organizations for that. You actually have to go outside of that, all right? Because Answers in Genesis has a lot of groupthink going on, and they just have a single agenda. Let's back up. So as Genesis History, again, I thought that was a watershed moment. It created kind of a new separate group, and it turns out that group has kind of morphed into, generally, there are no like clear breakpoints between any different groups of young Earth creationists. There is cross-pollination, just not a lot of it, but there is cross-pollination of some scientists doing things and working with others in young Earth creationism. But it's a lot of silos. And if I could characterize the silo of Is Genesis History, it is the collection of all those that are more amenable to thinking in certain ways that I will call what Answers in Genesis is saying are young Earth evolutionists. Will this next film have as much influence? I don't think so. But the fact that it collected together a group of people that seem very different and kind of tied them together in some ways has given them a little bit more voice in the young Earth creationist world than they had before. And maybe that's a little bit of why Ken Ham, and specifically Ken Ham and his organization Answers in Genesis, just doesn't feel like they can sit still and allow for another collection of individuals to have any larger voice, because I think they really are concerned about the influence that these individuals are having. Right. That does bring us back to responding to Answers in Genesis. All right, so Answers in Genesis now has done 7 articles that all have touched on various elements of concern they have about the direction that some young earth creationists are taking. They're not saying they're not young earth creationists, and they don't have some, they're not fundamentally bound by some similar principles, but they're worried that these young earth creationists, which they're calling young earth evolutionists, are on a slippery slope. And they haven't slipped all the way off of the young earth creationist bandwagon, but they see them as, if they don't fall off the bandwagon, they're at least laying the groundwork for allowing those who follow them and their works to become influenced by evolutionary theory to the point where they may slip off the young earth creationist bandwagon. All right, so they see them as being a danger that way. And so they're on 7 articles, and now there's been a couple different responses from those young earth evolutionists themselves, responding to these articles that are very public, right in the front of the Answers in Genesis webpage. In fact, often they're kept up there for 2 or 3 days, even as they cycle in new stories. They keep the young earth evolution articles on the very top of the page, so that's the first thing viewers see. That shows you a little bit of this is what we really want you to see. We're really concerned about this young earth evolution thing. So there's been 3 different primary responses that have been public responses so far. 2 of them from Coulson, who is one of these, who has specifically been called out in one of the articles, and one of the articles at at Answers in Genesis has drilled into his work. And then another one by Marcus Ross. All right, so this one came out today. Coulson does a really great job. I'll link this in below. He does a very good job of just addressing the basic issue of how different are we, and saying that he doesn't say it this way, but he calls Answers in Genesis basically they're hypocrites, right? They're complaining about things that they themselves are doing, right? So this isn't really the issue, all right? That there must be something else. I think that something else is probably a little more personal, but they don't want to go there, so they're trying to find other reasons to complain about these individuals, young earth creationists, they're young earth evolutionists. And so King Coulson is going over hey, here's straight from the Answers in Genesis website, a new wrinkle in sneaking evolution of the church is something we're terming young earth evolution. This is from their cover page at Answers in Genesis to review all the articles or set the stage for all their articles. Subtle ideas that don't comport with Scripture or are unnecessarily accommodating of evolutionary ideas are causing problems within the church, confusing the people in the pews. And what he does in this video is he does a really fantastic job of showing that something I've pointed out and many others have pointed out, but I think he does a much better job than I did, of saying, look, you go to the Ark encounter, right? And when you step on the Ark encounter and you go through it and you walk through it and you see, here you go. You see that they have the Ark Horse, right? The Ark kind horse. And what was that? All right, so, it was this thing that looks a lot like Mesohippus, this thing that evolutionists say is like a 30 million year old horse that has 3 toes instead of 1. And Answers in Genesis is showing this original horse kind that all other horses come from. And so what are they doing? Did any young earth creationists come up with this idea that all the horses, including the 1-toed horses and these things in the fossil record that are 30 million years old, or for them, some part of the flood record, did young earth creationists come up with the idea that they have all evolved from a common ancestor into 150 different species of horses? No, they've obviously have seen the evidence from evolutionary biologists about the similarities in structures, and looked at the evidence from evolutionary biology and concluded that they belong in one kind, right? And so they accept that all this diversification happened at a different speed than evolutionary biologists do. But nonetheless, they are accommodating evolutionary theory. And like he says, what's wrong with that? There's nothing wrong with looking at the observations and the evidence that others have looked at. We have a disagreement about the rate and ultimately about whether there can be common ancestry of all organisms. But we don't disagree, actually, with evolutionary biologists that there is commonality or common ancestry of horses. Now, some creationists still don't buy into full common ancestry of horses. And Coulson brings that out. He said, look, not even all young Earth creationists agree on this. And yet Answers in Genesis is just laying it right out there, right in their Ark encounter, right? Pointing to like there's a common ancestor of all horses. So they're importing, to go back to the quote, subtle ideas that don't comport with Scripture or unnecessarily accommodating of evolutionary ideas are causing problems within the church, confusing people in the pews. Yeah, people get confused when they go to the Ark encounter, right? Because they think they've been taught that, they may be wrong about what they've been taught or they didn't understand it. But typically most young Earth creationists or Christians or young Earth creationists in the pew who don't know anything about science, I think that God created all the different species, or at least produced zebras and horses, or at least if there's horses, maybe horses and zebras are similar. Horses and donkeys are separate creations. But that's not what most young Earth creationists actually believe, the ones that are the spokespeople for young Earth creationism. So they go to the Ark and then they see a one-toed horse that they've, if they go to a secular museum, they're going to see that same horse at the bottom of this phylogenetic tree, showing how they're all related to this common ancestor. And that sure looks a whole lot like evolution, and people get confused, right? And they do ask questions, and they ask questions all the time. I see them on the chat boards and in the Facebook posts and so forth. They're really confused by the messages from Answers in Genesis on this. So here they are saying these young Earth evolutionists out there are confusing people, and so rather than, okay, we're going to train train people who listen to us to understand the terms, we're basically going to accept the fact that our audience is ignorant and we don't want to confuse them. So we're just going to keep it simple for them. So we don't want these young Earth evolutionists using these terminologies and confusing people. It's a bunch of semantics. Coulson's position on horse evolution and whether horses are related to cows is no different than Answers in Genesis position. All right, so he's pretty much bringing out the fact that Answers in Genesis accepts all kinds of evolutionary assumptions and evolutionary ideas in how they've developed their positions on kinds and the extent to which kinds, how broad the kinds are. And he said in the future video he's going to talk about astronomy and about geology and how they're also importing geological old age ideas, and they're perfectly accepting of those as well, many of those as well. So are they, old age, creationist without knowing it? I don't know. At the end of the day, all these young creationists are not that different. They are exploring some different ideas and different ways of explaining the data, and they would disagree on those things. But to call them out as if they're some kind of danger is to call out the danger within your own self in this case. I think it's a giant self-own on Answers in Genesis part, because everything I read from these articles, I say, I don't see how this isn't talking about yourself, not about other young Earth creationists. Okay, oh yeah, Coulson also has another video which is really excellent, and it reviews one specific article on young Earth creationism, and it's the one that complains about him and his particular views, which is kind of an exploration of the idea of how much appearance of age was the world created. How did God create things that appear to be old, and how is that age kind of built in? How is that age built in? And I don't have time to do it right now, so I'm going to put a link to it. And he just really eviscerates the whole argument made in this particular article by Answers in Genesis, and shows just how fallacious their argument is. I mean, just logically, some of these Answers in Genesis articles just make no sense at all. I don't even know how to talk about them. Some of the arguments are so ridiculous. And so I think that some of these younger evolutionists, rightly so, are kind of flabbergasted at why be so outspoken on this and try to label others with pejorative labels? I mean, does Answers in Genesis talk about evolutionists, right? They like to be evolutionist, right? They label people as an evolutionist, whether they're believe in, particular forms of evolution or not. As long as they have any inkling of any idea of evolution, they call them evolutionists. And why do they do that? Because if you say they're an evolutionist to their audience, they're bad. Don't listen to them. That's what they're trying to do here. They're trying to say, don't listen to these people. Why not? Why not listen to them? That's the really interesting question. Because from what I've seen, I can't see the reasons why in the articles themselves. I think there's other motivations. Now, they have other articles coming out. Maybe they'll finally convince me that there is some reason to believe that these young Earth evolutionists truly are different and a danger to traditional young Earth creationism. Okay, the other response to young Earth creationism is what was yet another excellent discussion by Marcus Ross, who does quite a wide-ranging discussion on the YouTube station, What Your Pastor Didn't Tell You. Okay, and in that discussion, he very articulately covers a number of different areas that Answers in Genesis is wrong about, has misconceptions about, and he's as mystified, I think, as I am about how Answers in Genesis thinks this is a valuable exercise to be labeling folks like him as evolutionists, when he finds it very difficult to find any significant differences in his views with Answers in Genesis. And I do as well. Now, I have pointed out, I think that Marcus Ross and Ken Coulson and Todd Wood and Kurt Wise, and you go down the list of a number of other younger members of the young Earth creationist world, right, that are kind of up and coming. The ones that are labeled young Earth evolutionist. And I do find there is a difference. All right, I do sort of categorize them in my mind as a different set, a different form of young Earth creationism. But it's not because of their core beliefs, right? Their doctrinal statements. And they believe all the other core parts of the basics of the scientific explanation that young Earth creationists hold. It's more of an approach of how they approach science and how they approach apologetics. How do they approach how to argue their case? That's where I see the difference. And so I think there is a real difference there, but that's not sort of the angle that Answers in Genesis is taking. But we'll see in the next couple articles what they do. All right, let's get away from that because there's going to be lots of other times to talk about that. I'm going to do a whole separate video on Coulson's response and an article that Coulson has about design versus common ancestry, which I think is really intriguing, and I think will show why he is misunderstood. Let's put it that way. I just want to bring to your attention a really ridiculous article at Institutes for Creation Research. And I don't use the word ridiculous very often or just dumb, but this one is right up there. The Hexagon, an indication of order and design in nature. That's what I thought. The Hexagon. What's going on here? It's by a Jonathan Corrado, who has a PhD, and it's actually in some area of engineering. All right, and he's been an engineer for the Defense Department for a long time, but he also has a theology degree. And I've noticed that he's written a bunch of articles, a bunch being 7 or 8 articles within the last year. So 2022, 2023. And so he seems to be a recent new author to Institute for Creation Research. Not that he's an employee of theirs, but he would be like a paid writer for them, or he writes articles for them that they're willing to publish. Let me just read a little bit of the first part, and I'm going to read the last paragraph. That's all you need to hear to get a sense for this article. In nature, non-coincidental patterns in geometry exist everywhere. Right, so he's saying there's non-coincidental patterns. They're all around us. I agree. The world, as I look out my window here, the world's not a complete random chaotic mixture, right? It's not complete randomness at all. There's a lot of order to things that I see. But the number 6 appears to overshadow nature's mathematical landscape. Somehow 6 is more important than other numbers. There's 6 sides to this hexagon. And we see this pattern of 6 all over the place. I find this To be honest, I found this a little striking just to say number 6. It comes so out of the blue for me, but especially since when you do a lot of biblical studies, you realize that the number 7 is really important. Okay, this number 7 is so symbolically significant and literally significant in so many different places in Scripture. You have to understand the relationships of sevens, right? And not just 7, but multiples of 7 and so forth, have a ton of meaning in Scripture. So I just found that odd when I started reading. But the number of 6 appears to overshadow nature's mathematical landscape. Whether in beehives, rock formations, insect eyes, the number 6, specifically hexagon geometry, stands front and center. Could this just be a mathematical coincidence? Or is there something more to this widespread hexagonal geometry? And you know where this is going to go. Look, there's so many hexagons out there. Hexagons aren't random, therefore they have to have a designer. Right? Hexagons are proof of design. And they're proof of a designer. Because, I mean, how else would hexagons happen? Right? Hexagons can't be formed from randomness, right? From chance. Therefore, they have to have a designer. Let's go down to the last paragraph. Hexagon geometry, random or designed? Okay, I'm going to read this second to last paragraph. I'm going to read it, and I'm going to try not to comment. I'm going to hope that all of you out there watching will recognize just how ridiculous this statement is, just how vague and fluffy it is. And it boils down to really not saying anything. All right, not saying anything of substance here. But it sounds kind of nice to someone who's been trained that randomness is antithetical to God. And since we can look around us and we don't see or perceive randomness, therefore God made everything. Right? It's just really making it a very, very simple, basic argument for the existence of God. But just look at the way he makes it. Evolutionists theorize that the universe came into being by random means. Randomness inherently lacks symmetry, as the concept of symmetry implies order. Quite simply, randomness lacks any evidence of design, because if design is demonstrated to any degree, that would imply it's no longer random. Boy, it's so tempting to comment here. Nature, on the contrary, doesn't display randomness. In reality, as evidenced by the number 6, nature exhibits quite the opposite. Ultimately, hexagonal geometry is exhibited in beehives, rock formations, turtle shells, and insect eyes because the same perfect designer designed them all in perfect proportion, unison, and harmony. You got all that? You convinced? Is that not the best argument for design and for the existence of God you've ever heard? Now, I just want to remind you that I am a Christian. I believe in God. But this is a ridiculous argument. All right, this is not the way to go about making a compelling argument for the existence of God and how he works in this world. I'm just going to leave it at that. Just had to show you this paper on hexagonal geometry. Well, let's move on. Cavefish. All right, so ICR has been talking a bit lately about how they're involved in several research projects. And most of these research projects now all revolve around some aspect of trying to demonstrate the actual existence of continuous environmental tracking. That's Randy Guglielmus, the president of ICR, his dream child of a replacement for natural selection and mutations as a driver of sculpting and shaping organisms or helping them to adapt to this world. So his idea is continuous environmental tracking, which I don't have enough time to go over and talk about. But the point is that they have developed a couple research programs in order to try to actually test their model. All right, I give them props for saying we need to test it. We need to come up with some evidence for it ourselves. And so they came up with this cavefish research thing, which I've heard them talk about. And I remember hearing Brian Thomas talk about it not long ago. And I thought, boy, I don't think you're going to accomplish what you are trying to with this particular model. So now we have a report on cavefish research, which is in the latest issue of Acts and Facts. And you're looking at the entire report on what's happening with their research. Let me repeat that. You're looking at the entire report here. So I can read the whole thing to you in 2 minutes. At the Institute of Creation Research, we're investigating the Mexican tetra as an experimental model for rapid adaptation by animals to different environmental conditions, such as moving away from an underground cave system into sunlight. All right, so Mexicana tetra is a blind cavefish. So you know that there are many organisms called troglodytes in general that are organisms that move into dark environments. And as a result of being in the dark environment, they adapt to that darkness by doing things like, I don't need any eyeballs anymore because I can't see anything anyway, so I'm going to preserve energy by getting rid of my eyes. You don't necessarily need flashy colors because you're in the dark and there's no reason to have those either for sexual selection or for warding off predators or whatever reason you might have those flashy colors for. And so we observe in the world that this happens, right? There's no doubt that this is an observation that organisms lose their color. They basically become white. They lose a number of different other sensory organs that they may not need in these reduced environments. Okay, now the question is, how did that happen? And Institute for Creation Research wants to say that's not natural selection and mutations. This is continual environmental tracking. The organisms themselves track their environment. They sense their environment. There's like, it's dark. Well, it's dark. And so I've already pre-programmed. I have stuff inside of me that says, if you're in a dark environment, stop doing this. All right. I have programs that can run and change the individual essentially. And so organisms adapt. And what we're seeing is this kind of quick adaptation to their local environments. And it's not actually nature selecting for individuals that have mutations and saying that particular mutation works best in this environment, you'll have offspring. But it's actually individuals that are actually adapting to that environment through pre-programmed change. In other words, God pre-installed all the different genetic information they needed to adapt to whatever conditions they would be in the future. And so he knew that someday some of these fish would be in the dark, and so gave them programs so that they could be turned on. And when those programs are turned on, or in this case, you might think of it as they can be intentionally turned off, like making melanin, all right, which is the pigmentation in the skin. Like, oh, I sense the environment. I don't need to make melanin anymore. I turn that program off. Okay, that's the gist of it. So let's look at what their research is doing. These images show, the images right above here, 2 blind cavefish morphotypes in left lateral views. In the upper image is an adult cavefish showing native features. So the upper image is like, that's what Mexicana tetra looks like if you look at an organism that's in the cave and it's in the dark. Right? You bring it out of the dark, take a picture of it. That's its appearance. Including the absence of an eye, a semi-transparent orange body, visible blood vessels, because they don't have pigmentation so you can see into their bodies, reflective lateral stripe, and low numbers of black melanin pigment spots, hence their lack of coloration. In the lower image is a juvenile cavefish raised under daily cycles of full spectrum, high intensity light for 40 days. 40 days and 40 nights. Get it? It's a Noahic theme to their research. Followed by 4 months of treatment with artificial daylight. In contrast to the upper image, pigmentation has comprehensively increased in this juvenile cavefish. The juvenile's parents were treated with high intensity light for 5 months before reproducing this fish. That's another interesting. What they have is a number of different variables they've changed at the same time. So I don't know how many controls they have. Well, I don't really know much at all about this research. What do you know about it? This is all, you know as much as I know now, because here is what's happening with their research program. Presumably there'll be some kind of paper someday that'll explain all these research methods and how they accomplished them. But I look at this and I say to myself, they have some more pigmentation. I think their point's going to be like, how did they get pigmented again if they had lost pigment? But I do want to point out one thing. They don't say that they regained their sight, right? They're blind cavefish. Bring them out, put them in the light, and doesn't say that they regained their sight, right? The loss of sight, the loss of that characteristic is the loss of a complex trait. I wouldn't expect that they would necessarily be able to turn their sight back on so easily. So either individuals or populations. But what they did was they got a little bit darker. I don't know if you've noticed, but I've got pretty light skin. And it's the wintertime here. I'm not getting a whole lot of sun. And so my skin's gotten about as light as it will get. And when it starts to get sunny and I go outside and I spend some time out there, my skin's going to get a little darker. I'm going to produce more melanin. So that is an environmentally induced response. So I'm not denying that the environment doesn't actually affect individuals. We have phenotypic plasticity, right? We are adapting with the set of genes that we have that allow us to change our physiological conditions, right? That's not the same as the population evolving and changing its characteristics over time, which includes changes in allele frequencies and changes in actual genes and what they're doing. And in the case of this cavefish not producing melanin, it doesn't say that they can't produce melanin at all, right? That's what ICR is going to need to do here. What they would need to do is they would need to show that this cavefish can't make melanin at all, right? It is incapable of making melanin. And then somehow when you bring it out and you give it light again, it becomes capable of making melanin again. Right? If you showed that, then you could show that there was an actual new program started or it repaired itself or some significant thing had happened that was kind of like, okay, this is a pre-programmed thing that allows us to remake our melanin. No, this is more like, yes, there's a trigger. If you don't have a whole lot of light, then you're not going to make a lot of pigment because there's a sensor. And so the blind cavefish have become lighter. Some of them have become lighter. Some of them probably have absolutely broken pigment genes, in which case you wouldn't be able to recapture pigment. But in the case of this tetra, they have some coloration. They're not completely white. Therefore, it suggests they're already able to make a little bit of pigment. And so that's really not much different than saying that you put me in the light and I'll make more pigment. All right, that is a response to the environment. This is not showing that organisms can change into new species really, really quickly, which is what ICR kind of wants to do. They want to say that a lot of species have formed from a common ancestor that was on the Ark, and it can happen quite quickly, and it can happen because organisms are adapting to their environment and then changing themselves into different species. This is just phenotypic plasticity. This is just changes in reactions of individuals to their environment. Now, I suspect that if they take those fish that have been in the light and they put them back in the dark, right, and keep them there for a long time, or maybe a generation or two, they're going to be light again. You're going to go back and forth. What they need to do is they need to go look at other organisms that have I'll say, been in cave systems longer and have evolved for a longer period of time, and so have become genetically better adapted to that environment. In which case, by natural selection. And then take them and expose them to the light and see if they become darker colored again, or see if they regain their sight or regain other characteristics that they have lost. All right. So if something's recently evolved and adapted to conditions, it can be just because they have lost partial abilities, or they are phenotypically used their phenotypic plasticity to adapt to that local condition. And so this is one of the tests you can do of whether something is actually phenotypically plastic or whether it has truly lost that character or completely adapted to that particular location in some way. I'm sure they're going to make a big deal about this research, but just looking at this description here, there are far too many other variables, and they would need to go into the molecular genetics of this in order to really be able to say something. And I think all it's going to be is a show and tell. Like, look at these fish. We took 50 fish here, took 40 fish here, and we see a change in the pigmentation. So look, that character can change. And my response is going to be like, whoop-de-doo. I mean, why did you have to do research to do that when there are thousands of other papers out there that already show up that evolutionary biologists have already demonstrated this particular effect anyway? So big deal. Yeah, that's it. That's it for this week in creationism. Thanks for hanging out with me. Hit that like, subscribe button, all that other stuff. We're going to talk more about young Earth evolution, and I've got a couple videos coming up that will look at some really specific topics within that realm of young Earth evolution. And I've got a couple other just like generic science topics that I want to have fun talking about. They're just things that I've talked about in class lately, and so are kind of on my mind. All right, so till then, we'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.